Hello and welcome to the third lecture on the introduction to the religion of Islam. In our last lecture, we finished with the story about Muhammad, who had the first revelation, and then he basically loses his conscience, and he was found by Khadija, his wife. At that point, he tells Khadija what happens, and he then expresses some doubts that he had, because according to him, he was not sure whether he actually faced an angel, a representative of God, or perhaps a demon who represents Satan, the evil side, who tries to mislead him. How can one tell the difference? Well, Khadija decides. She believes in him. She believes it's a divine revelation, but she decides to take Muhammad to a relative of them who's a monotheistic believer. So here we hear about a monotheistic believer who is a member of the family of Khadija. His name, by the way, is Waraka bin Nawfal, and he listens to Muhammad's story, and he immediately declares that this sounds to him like a real, true, authentic, divine revelation. This is not a satanic diversion. So basically that gives Muhammad a stamp of authenticity, if you like, given to him by a representative of the former monotheistic religions. That sounds quite familiar, because if you recall, ladies and gentlemen, the story about Jesus. When Jesus was born in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 2, Jesus is taken as a baby to the temple. And there, his family meets two people, Anna, the prophetess, and Simon, the old man. And they both represent the old Judaism, identifying the Messiah, certifying that he is the man, or the baby in that case. So what we see here is a similar framework in which the Messiah, in the case of Christianity, or the prophet, in the case of Islam, receives a stamp of authenticity by the representatives of the old religion. In the case of Muhammad, it's a monotheistic believer, and he says that indeed this is a divine revelation. So now that he feels secure, that there are no more doubts, Muhammad decides to reveal the secrets that he received from the angel Gabriel to the people surrounding him. Be good, worship God, everything is fine, people are willing to listen. But when Muhammad begins to talk about belief in one God in a society, remember it's Mecca, it's a center of cult of paganism, in a society that believes in many gods, that may undermine the prosperity of Mecca. Remember, Mecca is a center of pilgrimage at the time. What would happen if everyone abandoned the gods and start believing in one God? That may, of course, undermine the prosperity and the economical situation in Mecca. And therefore, along with many people who adorn him, who accept him as a prophet of the real God, there are those who resist his message. And the resistance to his message is growing greater and greater as time passes, until eventually Muhammad is threatened and he decides to leave Mecca. That happens in the year 622. 622 AD, it's the beginning of the 7th century. Muhammad takes his believers, takes his disciples, takes his followers from Mecca, and they all flee to another city called Yathrib. Later, it will be known as Medina. Why did Muhammad take his people, his followers, to Yathrib, of all places? Well, mind you, first, there were not too many options. The peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula is mostly a desert, so there aren't too many cities. But there are other options, not too many. Why Yathrib? Well, there are some explanations to that. I think that the most important one is the fact that in Yathrib, there's a population composed of pagans, but also of 3 Jewish tribes. And this is the crucial point. Muhammad seems to believe that if the pagans refuse to hear his message, perhaps the Jews will welcome him. It makes sense. Jews already believe in one God. So what's the big fuss? Let's call him Allah instead of the God of Israel and become believers in the new religion. It sounds quite compelling to believe that indeed the receptance of the message of Muhammad will be greater in Yathrib. Anyhow, the year 622 is the year in which this journey from Mecca to Medina takes place. As a result, in later times, this date was conceived to be the watershed line in the birth of Islam. It's called the Hijra. Hijra is basically a journey from one place to another. So the most critical issue here with regards to the Hijra is that it is later conceived by Muslims as the watershed line in the birth of Islam as a nation, as a religion. Islam will be formed in Yathrib, Medina, not in Mecca. So that's a crucial point in time. And therefore, in later years, when the Muslims will devise their civilization and they will devise their own calendar, which is different than the Christian and Jewish calendars, they would fix the Hijra year, 622, as the year 0 in their calendar. This is the beginning of the calendar, of the Muslim calendar. I'll get back to that later when we deal with the Islamic calendar, because this is one important issue that has deep ties to Islamic religion. Anyhow, remember, Muhammad expects the Jews to accept his prophecy, but the Jews are reluctant. So he does some things to acquire their support. For instance, when the Jews ask Muhammad, "Where do you pray? To which direction? Where did Allah tell you to turn when you pray?" Muhammad's answer is quite surprising. He tells the Jews that Allah ordered him to pray towards Jerusalem. Later, when the Jews ask him, "Do you have a commandment of fasting?" You know, we Jews fast on Yom Kippur, the Atonement Day, next to almost the beginning of the year. Muhammad's answer is, "Yes, of course, Allah told me to fast on the Atonement Day, same day." Lucky coincidence. Obviously, these were actions taken by Muhammad to make it easier for the Jews to join the new religion. Again, this is an academic approach. From an Islamic approach, it's different. Allah did tell Muhammad to pray towards Jerusalem, and he told him to fast on the Atonement Day. That's a given. But we're examining it from an academic point of view. So the Jews refused to accept Muhammad's prophecy eventually. And he's very disappointed of that. Why did they refuse? We don't really know, but we may have some explanations. One would be, of course, that if Islam is so similar to Judaism, then why move from Judaism to Islam? If it's basically the same religion, let's remain in our old religion, the religion of the fathers. Secondly, the Jews already had bad experience with the rise of Christianity, which also came from Judaism, was heavily influenced by early Judaism, and eventually became the arch enemy of Judaism. In the Byzantine era, Jews were persecuted by law in the Christian kingdoms. And that, of course, continued in the medieval time. So this may seem like a second coming of the same event, which eventually wasn't too good for the Jews. And I think that perhaps another consideration was that the Jews could not affiliate with the idea of an illiterate prophet. Jewish prophets know how to write and read. Muhammad, according to tradition, didn't. Maybe that also kept the Jews away from the prophecy of Muhammad. Whatever the explanation historically was, the point is that the Jews refused to accept Muhammad. And therefore Muhammad decides to move away from the Jews to the pagans. Mind you, this is very similar to the way early Christianity evolved. Jesus turns mostly to the Jews. Yes, we do have some examples of Jesus taking care of the Samaritan woman and so on, but these are the exceptions. It's mostly a religion that comes from Judaism and turns to the Jews. But at some point, after the crucifixion, we read in the New Testament several times in several places that the focal point now shifts from Judaism. The Jews refuse to accept Christianity, and therefore the focal point now moves to the pagans. The same happens in the case of Muhammad. Now, the shift in this case from the Jews to the non-Jews, to the pagans, has some consequences. One thing is that Muhammad decides to effectively fight against the Jewish tribes, and eventually he slaughters the men of one of the Jewish tribes. He deports two other tribes. So that was basically the end of Judaism in Medina, in this city. But other than that, from the theological point of view, Muhammad decides that from now on, the direction of prayer will no longer be Jerusalem. From now on, it will be Mecca. It's quite surprising, you see, because Mecca is the holiest site in Islam. You'd expect it to be the default for the direction of prayer, but no, it wasn't. The first option was Jerusalem. Mecca is the second direction of prayer. And the second thing is that the Atonement Day, Yom Kippur as the day of prayer, is now cancelled, and instead the Muslims, as you will see later, they now receive an entire month of fasting, and that month is called Ramadan. We'll get to that later, don't worry about that. So I'm just mentioning that at this point. After the story of Muhammad and the Jews in Yathrib ends eventually, Muhammad gains control over Yathrib, and then the next step was to wage war against the people of Mecca, and eventually, I'll make a long story very short because this is beyond the scope of our lectures, he takes over Mecca in the year 630 AD, and after Mecca comes the entire Arabian Peninsula, and until the death of Muhammad in the year 632, the entire Arabian Peninsula is Islamicized. It converts to Islam. But I'd like to make a point here. You see, even though technically that was the situation, there was a problem with that. You see, did people really convert to Islam within 2 or 3 years all over the Arabian Peninsula because all of them were convinced that Islam is the right way and they all abandoned their own old pagan religion? I don't think so. It didn't really happen this way. It was mostly out of fear that the other tribes agreed to convert. How did the conversion take place? Well, basically, representatives of a tribe, which could be hundreds of kilometers away from Mecca, would come, stand before Muhammad, and declare their new faith on behalf of the members of the clan or the tribe remaining back home. So technically, for many people, the conversion to Islam was a technical step made out of fear. And I'm quite sure that many of them believe that once Muhammad dies, they will get back to the old ways. What they didn't know is that after Muhammad's death, there will be a row of strong leaders. The first of them is Abu Bakr, who's a relative of Muhammad, and then Omar and Uthman and Ali, and they will enforce Islam on those who already converted. So it may have started in a bit of a problematic manner, this conversion, but eventually it will stick, and the Arabian Peninsula will remain Islamic till this day, obviously. At this point, I'd like to end the short survey of the events that led to the rise of Islam. And in the next lecture, I'd like to move on to a comparison between Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.